In the quiet farmlands of Missouri, 1839, there was a family whose name was whispered with both respect and fear, the Whitmers. Behind their church pews and farm gates, a darkness festered, one that few dared to speak aloud. For a young black man working their land, survival meant silence. But silence was never enough. What happened inside the household would expose not just cruelty, but the brutal truth of who mattered and who didn't. In a world built on inequality, what secret could be so horrific that even the graves of Missouri soil refused to keep it buried? Before tragedy struck, Elijah was just a boy of 17. Born into bondage, he was raised on the Whitmer property, tending livestock and working the fields from dawn until the stars lit the sky. To outsiders, the Whitmers appeared righteous, a church-going family, wealthy enough to command respect in their community. But Elijah knew better. He saw the way their eyes lingered on him, not as a human being, but as property, as something to own. Despite the chains of his world, Elijah dreamed of freedom. At night, he would whisper to the stars about St. Louis, about crossing the river into Illinois where abolitionist voices promised sanctuary. But dreams in Missouri were dangerous, especially for someone like him. The Whitmers kept their power through fear, punishments that left scars not only on the skin but on the soul. And in 1839, Missouri was a state boiling with tension. Slaveholders desperate to protect their way of life, whispers of rebellion in the air, and a nation teetering between justice and oppression. For Elijah, life had become a game of survival. Each day he worked the fields, careful not to anger his masters. Each night he carried hope like a fragile ember hidden deep inside. But that ember was about to be tested by a truth far more horrifying than he could imagine, because the Whitmer family's cruelty wasn't limited to the whip or the chain. There were darker rituals, whispered practices, that turned Elijah's quiet hope into a nightmare he could never escape. The Whitmer estate was built on appearances. In town, they hosted church gatherings, spoke of morality, and preached about obedience. But on their land, hidden from public eyes, a different set of rules applied. Elijah began to notice patterns. The locked barn at night, the way certain enslaved people would vanish for days and return with haunted eyes, and the chilling silence that followed. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that if he kept his head down, he might one day find a chance to escape. But fate had other plans. One evening, he was ordered to carry supplies to the barn. Inside, the air reeked of something foul. Candles burned low, and strange symbols marked the floorboards. At the center stood members of the Whitmer family, their expressions calm, almost devout, as though what they did there was holy. Elijah's task was simple: clean the room. But as he worked, he realized what had happened. The stains on the wood were not just from animals. The whispers he overheard spoke of purity, of cleansing, and of breaking those they owned. In that barn, cruelty was ritual. It wasn't just about control. It was about degradation, a twisted belief that enslaved bodies were vessels to be used, broken, and discarded. Over the weeks, Elijah became their next target. The practices he was forced to endure blurred the line between punishment and something darker, something unspeakable. Each act stripped away his humanity in their eyes, reminding him that to them, he was not a man, not a soul, but an object. The other enslaved men and women avoided his gaze, not out of cruelty, but because they knew they'd endured it too. To acknowledge it was to risk breaking under the weight of it. Elijah learned to mask his pain, to swallow his fear, and to carry the shame in silence. But silence has a breaking point. And Elijah's came the night he was forced to watch another young boy taken into the barn. The boy's cries echoed to the darkness, each sound carving deeper into Elijah's heart. That night he knew, if he stayed silent, he was complicit in the Whitmer's horrors. He had to choose between risking everything or losing himself completely. It was a humid summer night in 1839 when Elijah made his decision. The boy who had been taken into the barn hadn't returned. The Whitmers carried on with their lives as though nothing had happened. But Elijah couldn't. His ember of hope, once fragile, now burned with fury. He slipped into the barn under cover of darkness. The smell hit him first, sweat, blood, and candle wax. In the corner, he found what was left of the boy's belongings, tossed aside like rags. The reality was undeniable. The Whitmer secrets were soaked into these walls, into the very wood beneath his feet. Elijah could no longer pretend survival was enough. His only chance was escape. He gathered what little food he could steal, memorized the path toward the river, and waited for the night the Whitmers would be too drunk with their own rituals to notice. When that night came, Elijah ran, barefoot, silent, his lungs burning with every step. Behind him, the estate loomed, its dark secrets festering in silence. Ahead lay the uncertain wilderness, dogs in the distance, and the faint glimmer of the river that could mean freedom or death. Every branch that snapped beneath his feet felt like a signal. Every shadow seemed like the Whitmers were closing in. But Elijah didn't stop. He couldn't, because what he had witnessed was not just cruelty. It was a system built on stripping dignity, built on silence. And silence was no longer an option. Elijah's fate remains uncertain. Some say he made it across the river into Illinois, carried by abolitionists who helped him vanish into freedom. Others whisper that he was caught, dragged back to Whitmer's, and silenced forever beneath Missouri soil. But what is certain is this: Elijah's story is not just his own. It echoes through generations, a reminder of how systems of power allowed families like the Whitmers to hide their horrors in plain sight. It speaks to the resilience of those who endured the unimaginable and the cost of silence forced upon them. The Whitmers' name still appears in old records, often praised for their standing in society. Yet the truth tells another story, a story of human beings dehumanized, used, and discarded. And Elijah's story forces us to confront a painful question. How many lives were buried beneath the lies of respectability, never given the dignity of remembrance? Even today, the shadows of such injustices linger. They may not look the same as they did in 1839, but systems of oppression still find ways to silence voices, to strip humanity, and to bury truth beneath polished facades. Elijah's ember of hope reminds us that silence is never enough. To honor those who endured, we must speak, remember, and refuse to look away. Because history is not just what's written in books. It's what's hidden in the shadows. And the shadows are still speaking.